4 long years of the Bush presidency, and since then we've had 4 more. And it was a period of great defensiveness, trying to hold the line in environmental policy, trying to figure out where we could advance environmental solutions, very much shifting our focus to the states and away from the federal government. And then working sort of on the ground, trying to put in place what would be the building blocks of a national policy on climate change. So now we're in a completely new era, and I cannot emphasize how dramatic the shift has been in a very, very short period of time. And it really started the day Obama was elected. There was a tremendous effort during the transition, those just few short weeks, really 8 weeks, during November and December and early January, to put in place what would be environmental, how they would launch the whole policies across the whole government, but particularly on environment and energy. And one thing that the environmental community did was we actually all got together. There's an association of national organizations, we call it the Green Group, sort of a loose alliance, but we actually delved in at the same time and made a series of recommendations to the transition, agency by agency, department by department, what we thought, what had to be reversed and what could be advanced, what our priorities were. Then the overarching priority was to advance national climate policy to curb global warming aggressively. The other overarching goal was to really develop a whole management regime for the Arctic and the Arctic Ocean, which is melting very, very rapidly and is really the last ocean on the planet that is in a relatively pristine state where you could develop some very innovative management regimes before the ice melts and the marine transport and the oil and gas and the fisheries interests basically go in, take over, and start a massive era of exploitation there. So those are the 2 overarching goals. And actually, all of this information, it was called the Transition to Green, is on the web, and we have a collective website called saveourenvironment.org. So if you're interested in any of those recommendations, that's where you can find it, saveourenvironment.org. So as a new administration comes in, what happens? Well, you know, I was at the inauguration, maybe many of you were. It was interesting standing on the Mall. I was actually on the Capitol grounds because there was so much enthusiasm for this moment in time. And when President Obama gave his inaugural speech, the one issue that actually got a cheer was when he talked about a new energy commitment and investing in renewables and solar and wind. You know, it was a sober speech, but that was the one thing where there was sort of a cheer from the crowd. And I really think it showed in many ways what the shift was in the country towards heading down a very, very different road, a different future on energy and climate and environment policy. So when a new administration comes in, what's important? Well, the most important thing is really who's around him, because he sets a very strong course, but he's got to have people who can implement it for him. And on his appointments have been really stunning in the environmental sector and the energy sector. And just, I'm sure you're familiar with who some of these people are, but let me just review it. Lisa Jackson from New Jersey, Princetonian, former DEP commissioner here, now head of the Environmental Protection Agency. She's jumped in with a vengeance. She has a great background working on all the policies in New Jersey. She was a great innovator, particularly important in New Jersey's participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And she's on the ground and has great commitment, and I think she'll be a wonderful force. She's very committed to transparency, which is something that we didn't see in the last administration, to underpinning all of her decisions with sound science, which we didn't see in the last administration, to using the rule of law, and deeply committed to environmental justice, to speaking out to a much broader community than perhaps has been in the past. And actually that was something she said very forcefully to the environmental community in her first meeting. And she's happy to meet with the national environmental groups, and we're happy to meet with her too. But she intends to reach out to a much broader audience, particularly to people who are concerned about issues of disproportionate impact, who haven't been heard before in this process. Her very first meeting during the transition was with the EJ community. She's been at 2 conferences in New York, one on environmental health this week, one on environmental justice that We Act sponsored, must have been in early January. So she's going to set a very different course for the Environmental Protection Agency. The thing that's holding her back now is that she's got to get her assistant administrators in place and quickly so she has people on the ground, and she's certainly working on that, but the vetting process is a whole other issue. It's going pretty slowly. Carol Browner is the coordinator for energy and climate policy, otherwise the climate czar in the White House. Very key, pivotal role, a position that we in the environmental community felt was absolutely critical, that there was somebody absolutely in the White House who was trying to both coordinate with what was going on across all the agencies and be a powerful voice in that dialogue that happens inside the White House, where the economic crisis in the country is really the dominant topic, and how these things are woven together. It's very important. Carol has great record. She was the longest-serving administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, incredibly forceful, determined person, and I think is going to be a very powerful and important advocate on this issue, and it's going to be really, really good. Stephen Chu, Secretary of Energy, Nobel Prize winning, Nobel Prize laureate, unbelievably knowledgeable in the details of energy technology. I mean, if you was in a meeting with him last week, he's talking about, the design of lithium batteries, and, much more detail than I want to know, actually. But he really knows how to transform the energy sector. Now, you have to remember that the Department of Energy is 99% nuclear weapons and weapons cleanup, and 1% or even less advancing clean energy policy. So it'll be a real challenge for him to keep focused on this priority of the Obama administration and his agenda. He's going to need to get somebody to manage the rest of the department, all the labs and various aspects there, because it is a colossal agency. And I think he comes out of technology and science, not out of politics, but Washington is a political town. The day that we met with him, he had been to the testify in front of the House Science Committee, and he had spent his time trying to explain to 2 Republican congressmen why the science of climate change was irrefutable. And, they were deniers. And he came back. I have to say, the man was stunned. I mean, I sort of felt like he's thinking, how am I going to, why do I have to deal with this kind of thing on a day-in and day-out basis? But Congress is part of the job, and I think it's going to be a real challenge to move these agendas forward. And he's going to, it's going to take a lot of his time, and he's going to need some real help in doing it. But he's a stunning appointment, as were the 2 other, I think, very key science positions. John Holdren, who's head of Office of Science, OTPS, whatever, Science and Technology in the White House from Woods Hole Ecosystem Center, and Harvard. Fabulous appointment, deeply committed on the issue of climate change, confirmed last week. And also Jan Lipchenko, leading ocean scientist from Oregon State University. Both she and Holdren, I think, were head of the AAAS. And both of them were actually confirmed last week. Their appointments were held up, not for anything they were doing, but actually by the senator from New Jersey, Senator Menendez, for a different reason, Cuba policy. But that sort of shows you how complicated Washington can be. But they're now there, moving forward on their agenda, and we're just very excited by the prospect of working with them. The other thing is that all these people are people who we at NRDC and across the environmental community have been working with for years. There has been an ongoing dialogue, discussion with them, whether they're in government or out of government. So, there is a real open-door policy right now in Washington to have a dialogue and work together on what are the policies that we need to put in place, how do we structure those, what are the politics that are necessary to make that happen. And I think you can't underestimate the power of politics here. We've spent a lot of years, and this is where NRDC really has tremendous expertise, is in the design of policy. But actually achieving that policy by trying to figure out the politics, what it's going to take to get support and get the votes is incredibly challenging, and that's really where we are now. And I think you could see that most specifically. First, the president comes out with the stimulus package. The stimulus package and what he has done so powerfully is to really link strong economic recovery directly with a new clean energy strategy and solving climate change at the same time. And I put it in that order because that's the order that the American public sees it in. I mean, all the polls basically show you American public gets energy, they don't really get climate. I think from our point of view, climate is the most important issue. Everything flows from it. But to sell it, we've got to sell it through the energy doorway, not through the climate doorway, because we won't get enough support doing that. And I think, again, that's where Obama has done a really brilliant job. So he comes out with a stimulus package, and there is a lot in there on clean energy, a lot on weatherization, a lot on efficiency, a lot in greening federal buildings, tax credits for renewables. So the big challenge now is this is sort of a dress rehearsal for what climate policy can be. And our challenge is to make sure, and his challenge, but I think the advocacy community has a role here too, to get that money out the door and to actually have a very strong system of accountability, to make sure the money is spent for what it was intended to be spent for, and that it actually achieves the results. I think one thing that's going to be absolutely critically important, particularly in the energy sector, both on renewables and on efficiency, is to be able to prove that more energy is being provided by renewables, that the percentage from renewables is actually going up, and that efficiency actually works and the cost of energy is going down. That's going to be absolutely critical in the climate debate that goes on in the Congress. We have to prove that these strategies work, and this is a dress rehearsal. It's got to work. We've got to get it done quickly and have the systems in place to do it. And all the money's going out. It's going to the states. It's going to the cities. So this is something that actually has to be done on the ground across the country. It needs to be done back at DOE too, but not only. And I think that's where people on the ground in a whole host of different positions can really help. I know I'm in New York City. We're very interested in what New York City plans to do. We're going to keep very close tabs on it. We have offices in Chicago, California. We'll be doing that there as well because, one, we want to tell a good story. I hope there will be a good story to tell, but we want to tell it because I think that success will breed success. And so that, there's a lot to be done on the stimulus package. It's going to be very, very important. The next thing was the president's budget. He came out with a budget and cleverly, you might say, he actually put in the revenue part of the budget, revenues from a climate auction. And this was paired with middle-class tax cuts. So, he in his State of the Non-State of the Union speech that he made to Congress, he asked Congress to deliver climate legislation to him. And then he came out with the budget, and he had the revenues actually from climate legislation in it in the out years. That became a very controversial issue. And in the budget deliberations that have been going on in the House and the Senate, that revenue has not been included. But I think what it did was it sort of unleashed a debate in the Congress that we don't want to deal with it in the budget, and one reason to deal with it in the budget is that the budget passes with a bare majority. You don't have to have the 60 votes that you have in a regular piece of legislation. So that was sort of, we can get through with 51 votes. But people, in Congress, they don't want to do that. They actually want to have a full debate. So that's good. They're kind of asking, let's actually consider the issue at hand, which is in some ways a lever to move it forward. The passage of the president's budget is very, very critical, even though this isn't in it, because, it's a sign of how strong he is going to be or not going to be. And we were in a conference call with Speaker Pelosi yesterday where she's basically saying, we've got to get this budget passed. This is, we can't do anything until we get the budget passed. So, that's a priority for us too. There's a lot of money in there to invest in environment and energy that hasn't been in there before. So, we're sort of taking these things by stages, and this is a very important second stage, and we're kind of up against it right now. So now we're at the point, there are two sort of parallel things going on, and this is mostly about climate, what's happening in the legislative process, which I'll talk about in a second, and then what's happening in the administrative process. Well, there the change is really stunning, and really on a weekly basis. It's interesting. I think when I was here last time, I talked about, we had on our website something called the Bush Record, and every time a bad environmental policy came out, we stuck it up there. After a while, there were just hundreds of things, and it wasn't worth keeping it up because it was just unrelenting. But now we're experiencing the exact opposite with the Obama administration. The rapidity with which policy reversals are happening, the number of initiatives that are coming out administratively, where they have a lot of authority, are stunningly quick. On January 26th, literally the Sunday after the inauguration, we were invited to come to the White House for a presidential announcement, and the president was directing EPA and the Department of Transportation to review the Bush decisions on the California waiver on carbon emissions from cars and improve fuel efficiency of cars. That was the DOT part. That was 6 days after he got going, and that was a directive to LaHood in the Department of Transportation and a directive to Lisa Jackson. Then she, immediately got to work, and on February 6th, she announced that she would, had started the administrative regulatory process to review the California waiver. On February 5th, the president announced new appliance efficiency standards. On February 24th, that was the State of the Union when he asked Congress for the legislation. On March 10th, Lisa Jackson issued an announcement that she would start reviewing global warming pollution coming out of the industrial sector. On March 11th, Secretary Salazar from the Interior Department announced that he would review energy policies in the Interior Department and shift them from oil and gas leasing to investing in renewables, which has its own environmental issues associated with it. And then yesterday, on March 31st, Chairman Waxman of the Energy and Commerce Committee came out with a discussion draft on climate legislation. So literally, it's almost hard to keep up. Every 2 or 3 days, either on the administrative side or on the legislative side, there's a new initiative. So there is an incredible drumbeat going on. There's an enormous amount of work that has to be done, particularly on the regulatory side, to review these decisions, to come out with new recommendations, to go through the steps that are necessary to put in place new policies. It can't be done overnight, but they can move quickly, and they're doing it literally with their hand tied behind their back because they don't have any of the assistant administrators or the additional appointments made to get these things done. But I think what it really shows you is an incredible determination by this administration to make particularly the issue of energy and climate a top-tier agenda issue, to link it directly with economic recovery. And there's a lot of dispute in Washington and in the sort of out in the pundits and the airwaves of, the economy is such a big challenge. Should we be linking these things, either the energy or education and healthcare, to them? Can't you just take on this one issue? But if you believe, as he seems to, and we certainly do, that these are the things that are going to unleash economic recovery, that there is a huge opportunity through energy investment, that a massive energy investment can actually unleash enormous job potential, help the manufacturing sector, create new opportunities both in the United States and internationally through a competitiveness role. These are things that can actually shift the country in a very positive direction. And so that is the path that he's following, and it's the path that we're following. But I just have to emphasize again how challenging it is, even with the presidential leadership, which we haven't had for 8 years, to actually achieve those significant gains in Congress. So just to dwell for a minute on what's happening legislatively on climate change. Last year we had a Lieberman-Warner bill in June, got 54 votes for consideration. There were really only about 44 senators maybe who would have actually supported it, well short of the 60 votes. There were 10 senators, mostly from the Midwest, who wrote a letter after that legislation did not move forward, and they kind of outlined, these are the issues that we have, and we're not going to support legislation unless these issues get addressed. And the issues were about economic competitiveness and manufacturing and job loss. They were, and that was in June, and now it's in April, and their challenge economically has only gotten much, much greater. So our challenge is to really make sure that the solutions to global warming actually have very strong economic footing, that the economic case is as strong as the environmental case, and there has been a very big investment in documenting what the jobs potential is in the green economy and how people can be retooled and redirected to these things. And there's a lot of great people working on this. Van Jones from Green for All, who is now in the White House, is one of them. The unions have been looking carefully at this. The Apollo Alliance, we're part of a coalition called the Blue-Green Alliance with several of the unions. This is a very, very important issue. We need to be able to document that these opportunities are really there. Then we need to get the companies that are actually doing these things to go into their local congressman and senator and actually document what the jobs are, and that there is a shift from sort of business as usual to these new investment opportunities. And then the economic and tax structure has to be designed in a way that it actually unleashes this opportunity. And it's interesting, we spent a lot of time talking to people in the tech sector, particularly in the renewable industry, and it's very interesting. We've subsidized sort of traditional sources of energy for a long time, whether it's nuclear, coal, oil. They have many, many subsidies built into the regulatory system. So now, there's discussion of we need subsidies to unleash these new technologies, and then there are these voices, well, why are we giving them subsidies? You're giving them subsidies because they're new industries, they're new businesses that need to be unleashed. Over time, you decrease those, but they can't compete head-to-head with industries that are getting subsidies. So you've got to shift that opportunity, and that's one of the things we did at NRDC is we created a group called the Center for Market Innovation. A lot of people with MBAs who've come in and actually are evaluating how do you structure that? How do you actually do that so it's a win-win for business and a win-win for the environment? Because in this climate, if we can't make the economic case, we're going to fail, no matter how important climate change is. And it's interesting. I was in a meeting, or I was at a board meeting with Al Gore, who's obviously the strongest proponent of this whole thing. And he said, I'm studying, and he's very interested in science. He says, I'm now studying what it is about the human brain that makes people, it gears them towards much more short-term decisions than long-term decisions. And the endorphins apparently get going if you make short-term decisions, and they don't if you make long-term decisions. So, we need to shift that, because this is a long-term problem. Climate change is upon us, but the whole political process is designed towards 2 or 4 year increments. And, we're talking about a 2020 timetable of reducing emissions, a 2030 timetable, a 2050 timetable. They're interested in 2010. And making that shift is just one of the most challenging things. So you need to be able to show immediate results as well as those long-term results. And that's one of the things that we're trying to pull together, is how you can make both of those things happen at the same time. And it's very, very challenging. So what does the administration need to do to sort of advance climate? And then we could talk about some other things. Well, one is to actually grant the California waiver, to let California regulate its carbon emissions. There are 20 states that are lined up to do that. They want to do it. They're going through the process that will allow them to do it. There's a lot happening right now in the automobile industry, the entire restructuring of the American automobile industry. An absolute basic need of that is to ensure that gets restructured in a way that's climate friendly, that the cars are more fuel efficient, that new technologies are coming out, that emissions are regulated as strongly as possible. One of the disappointments, actually, on January 26, Obama asked DOT to come out with new fuel efficiency standards, and they came out last week with a modest increase, not nearly the increase we would have liked to see. But they're struggling with, I understand, the survival of an industry, but these things have to come together, and that's what we're in the midst of, trying to figure out a design where you grab the opportunity that's there, but you do it in such a way that it has economic value, so you can actually get it through the political process. And the political process is very challenging. As I said, after the Lieberman-Warner bill came out, there were 10 senators that signed this letter, and now these are the blue dogs, mostly Democrats from the Midwest. Now there's 16 on that list. And so those are 16 people whose concerns you really have to understand and try to figure out how to address. And so when legislation gets designed, and Henry Waxman came out with his discussion draft yesterday, you've got to design a bill that actually deals with those issues, or you're not going to get those votes. I mean, part of it is having an on-the-ground campaign in the states, a huge push from the grassroots constituency, but the other is you actually have to design the bill to come around some of those issues. So the Waxman discussion draft, I think, is a very important signal going forward. He is moving on an aggressive timetable. He wants to get this bill reported out of committee by Memorial Day. The Speaker hopes to bring it to the floor in July. Hopefully the House will actually move a bill by the summer recess, and then it goes over to the Senate, which is really the biggest problem. And the Copenhagen meeting in December is looming. So we're in a countdown to Kyoto, and I think what has to happen there is that it'll be very hard to get a bill kind of signed, sealed, and delivered by Copenhagen. But the United States has to push, we have to push in Congress as far as we can, so we go to Copenhagen. The United States goes to Copenhagen with a very clear framework for what U.S. policy can be. And the reason this is important is that the rest of the world is looking to see what the U.S. is going to do. We were in a meeting with Minister Xia, who's the climate negotiator for China, and China they're doing a lot. They actually have efficiency. They're trying to improve their industrial efficiency by 20%. They have better automobile fuel efficiency standards than we do. Their economy is not growing as fast as it was, but it's still growing. But there are things that they're putting in place, but they're not going to adopt a economy-wide cap or get out ahead of climate policy before the United States does, and they're going to expect some kind of tech transfer and some kind of financial support to do it. I wonder why that's necessary. They have more money than we do. In fact, they have our money. But that's just the way the political equation works. So, going to Copenhagen, what we cannot do is what happened in Kyoto, where a policy was adopted in Kyoto and then they tried to bring it back to the Senate for ratification and it totally failed. So just from a political sense, you've got to have the design very well advanced in the political process in the United States, have that be pretty much the structure that people discuss in Copenhagen, even if it's not ready to be adopted, in order, because this is our process, for the United States, the Senate, to be willing to ratify something. If we do it the other way, I'm afraid we'll just fall the way we fell after Kyoto, which, we were the one nation of the developed world not participating. So that's a very serious problem. So we're in the countdown. We're moving as aggressively as we can. We're quite optimistic in the House. We're pushing very hard in the Senate. And we know it's interesting. If you're in this field, we've been preparing for probably 15 years for this moment, which is right now. I mean, this is the moment to try to get in place a policy that will actually be an economy-wide cap that will reduce carbon emissions 80% by 2050 and put in place the policy changes and unleash the innovations that will really be needed to make that happen. And we have a very short timeline in which to do this. There is not a lot of time. And the urgency is great and powerful. It's not, I think, widely appreciated. I think kind of raising the temperature on it politically, really holding people accountable on it is going to be very, very important. And then working out kind of the details in Congress. So there's sort of an inside game and there's an outside game, and each are very, very powerful and important. And I would say, there's growing recognition and growing support for climate action in Congress. And it's not only from the environmental community, the business community, fairly significant swath of the business community is supporting it, not because it's something they might want necessarily, but they need the predictability. When there's a climate regime across the world for many multinational companies, they need to know what it's going to be here. The capital markets have completely dried up because of the economic situation, but they've also dried up because of the unknown. And no financial institution is going to invest in a new coal plant if you don't know what the regulations are going to be on carbon emissions, because there's a huge liability out there if that's not fully understood. So actually, a number of the utilities, a number of the big manufacturing companies, they were all together in a group called the United States Climate Action Partnership, which NRDC was part of too. And they are calling for an economy-wide cap on carbon that unleashes new technology, deals with some of these transition issues, supports the research, development, and deployment of carbon capture and storage in the coal sector. Let me just talk about that for a minute too. Coal is 50% of our energy supply, and very dominant in India, very dominant in China. Coal will be with us for a long time. Maybe at some point we'll go past coal, but in the meantime we need to deal with coal emissions. Carbon capture and storage is the way to do that. It's interesting, the coal industry has shifted, I'd say, dramatically in the last 18 months on this. Now, we have clean coal. You've probably seen that all over the news media. It's not there yet, and clean, I think, is a misnomer, but we do need to get this technology going and out there, and that's going to be not only important to reduce carbon emissions, it's going to be important from the political equation because 50 senators in the United States Senate are from coal burning or producing states. So you cannot get those votes if you don't have a coal policy embedded in the legislation. And, I think you need it anyway because we have to deal with the emissions. So, that's just part of kind of what the political animal is. And actually the Waxman-Markey discussion draft that came out yesterday very much mirrors, not entirely, but sort of designed in a very similar way to what the U.S. Climate Action Partnership came out with, which is, I think they have a website. You could go to it and find out what the components of that are as far as targets and timetables, offsets, CCS deployment, and other things. So there is a tremendous amount happening now, and the president is definitely on the forefront leading. He's got his team deployed. The number one challenge is to do it in a way that works economically and actually unleashes an economic opportunity for the country. The politics are very, very, very difficult, and nobody should be lulled into thinking just because we have presidential leadership we're going to get congressional support. Not true. It's going to take a tremendous amount of work. So that's on the climate and energy side, which happens to be our number one issue. It's his number one issue. It's the environmental community's number one issue. That's where there's tremendous focus. Now, in the agencies, there's a lot going on, too. And Lisa Jackson, Secretary Salazar, and Interior Department, there will be a lot going on to reverse the policies of the Bush administration in a whole host of areas. And we'll work on those as well. But I think, right now the scene is so dominated by energy and climate that I think that's probably the thing to focus on and really talk about. So that's just an overview, and let's talk about it.
Can you say a few words about FutureGen? It was just revised, I think it was yesterday.
Did they revive it yesterday? FutureGen was interesting. FutureGen is a federal demonstration project for CCS, which the Bush administration, after they had supported it for quite a while, pulled the plug. And it's supposed to be sited in Illinois. You have to think it was completely political. Pulled the plug on Durbin, on Obama, right in the middle of the campaign. That's sort of what happened. When FutureGen got designed originally, it wasn't, we didn't particularly love it, but once it got as far as it got and they'd invested so much in it, we thought, you might as well go forward with it. And we're very focused on the need to actually get deployment, not only R&D on CCS, but deployment. And that's one of the mechanisms, one of the ways to do that. There are a bunch of demonstration projects that are beginning to go on now. And the other part of CCS that's really important is you've got to put in a whole regulatory structure. And EPA has been directed to start thinking about what that regulatory structure would be. You would need a series of pipelines. A lot of people think it's too much infrastructure. Well, we actually want infrastructure right now. I mean, we're looking for things to invest in from an infrastructure standpoint. And remember, we have an entire network of pipelines for natural gas all across the country. Why you couldn't have them for CCS at the same time? The other thing about CCS that's an interesting add-on benefit is that it can be used, by capturing the carbon, you can use it for enhanced oil recovery. And there's actually a tremendous amount of opportunity to develop more oil resources, quite a large volume. I don't have it at the tip of my tongue here, but there's a large volume of oil that can be brought online from enhanced oil recovery, domestic oil supply, which helps with energy independence, which is sort of we've been trying to make the case that that's something that people shouldn't lose sight of because it's a lot of oil and people are very concerned about imported oil dependency right now. So, yep.
I wonder if you can talk a bit about NASFE EPA and the endangerment finding that EPA is expected to make or has already made or is in the process of making, and how specifically the threat of regulation from the administrative and executive side may push some people in Congress to do more.
Yeah, that's a good question. This is the Supreme Court case that basically authorized EPA to regulate carbon, and then Steve Johnson, who was the administrator, sort of mumbled around and didn't do anything until the last second. So Lisa Jackson has taken that on. Our view is all of the above, to use California waiver to push the automobile industry, to use the endangerment provision to sort of get them going. And from a regulatory standpoint, none of the companies want that, either one. They're very opposed to it. That does put pressure on congressional action. Also, we might not get congressional action. That's the other reason why it's really important, because our goal is to get congressional action. Eventually we will, whether it's in the next 2 years, the next 4 years. It wouldn't begin to be implemented by 2012. But meanwhile, we need to reduce emissions right now. So the sooner EPA gets actually to put that in place, the better from our point of view. So it's just part of the whole strategy. Strategy is sort of all embracing. Anywhere you can get an emission reduction, get it. So if you can get it in state policies, get it. Renewable portfolio standards, the state level, federal level, EPA regulations. We're working on all of them. And people don't like that. That's good. Puts the squeeze on. Yep.
I wonder if you could speak to any specifics about the plan to win over the Midwest legislators, because I keep hearing people talk about.
Yeah, well, that's the key. The plans are, that was one of the premises of the U.S. Climate Action Partnership. These 26 companies, if you look at where these companies are, these are the states that these companies are in. And, part of the agreement, we sort of linked hands, jumped into the pool together, was that they would actually advocate economy-wide cap on carbon legislation this year, and that they would do it to those blue dogs. And they have had a lot of meetings with the blue dogs. So that's one part of the strategy. That's also why we're part of the Blue-Green Alliance, because labor in those states is very, very important too, and what happens to jobs and how to unleash job creation, that's the fundamental concern of the blue dogs. That is the issue. So the Blue-Green Alliance last Friday actually announced a whole set of climate principles, which very similar to the ones in U.S. CAP, and they're a part of the equation too, actually going on the ground and talking to Stabenow and Levin and McCaskill and Dorgan and others who are a problem. Then the environmental community has a very broad ground campaign. We have about 85 field organizers across the country. Gore's about to unleash twice that number, and the grassroots will be very activated over the next month, for the next several months.
Who's about to release twice that number?
Gore, the Alliance for Climate Protection.
Okay.
So everybody is it's sort of all hands on deck in every way. What we're doing is we're spending a lot of time actually going kind of state by state, district by district, to actually look at where the green jobs are and what is being added on, and getting those voices to go into their members. I think part of this is having the right people having the right conversations, and trying to find And I mean, there are lots. There are so many kind of clean tech, green jobs networks around the country now, coming in from different angles, whether they're in renewables or the Chicago Climate Exchange has, I think, 400 companies that are actually now trading carbon and would like early credit of some type, which they'd like to see in legislation. I don't know if it would be designed that way, but it's actually making the linkages. I've spoken at a couple of clean tech conferences, and the big manufacturing companies, they have legions of lobbyists in Washington. This is what they do. But a lot of these companies that are new, they don't have a political side, and trying to get them to be active and be active voices and really go and do the politics and explain how many jobs are being created, how many jobs could be created, if certain policies got put in place. That's a very important part of it. And then there's the whole media side. And one of the challenges on the media side is that there is, if you were watching CNN returns during the whole political process, clean coal just dominated, including on election night. So the coal industry is just investing massive amounts of money to sort of business as usual. And the oil industry is too, so will the Chamber of Commerce. So you can't win, I think, on an advertising media war. There's just not enough money to do that. It has to be really a grand campaign and both what we call grassroots and grass tops. Basically grassroots, large numbers, grass tops, the right people going in to talk to the various electeds.
I guess my question is more specifically, like, I'm from Indiana, and people talk about, it's one of these big states, and I know that companies like Duke Energy are part of...
yeah, he's doing a whole CCS thing in Indiana.
Right, and so they're part of CAP, right, and so...
Right.
And so they're making this, they're lobbying on, or supposedly they're going to be lobbying on behalf of a reduction policy, but then, Duke Energy in southern Indiana is really angry at the Obama policy because of the coal industry in Indiana. And I guess, for one thing, I have no idea. Like, I know in Indiana 90% of energy is produced by coal, but how many jobs? Like, I have no idea about the number of jobs that come from coal. And so, and it seems to me
but
like
that's why, that's really critical. Because, one of the things, Duke is a particular challenge. They're the third largest coal company in the country. Jim Rogers, the CEO, has come out. He's been pretty forceful about we need a cap on carbon, but whenever it's designed, it's not quite right, which is the challenge with him. But, part of our job is to hold them accountable. They came, after one of the Obama announcements, Duke came out with a very negative position on it. Jim, how can you do that? You're part of this U.S. cap. You agreed to be part of this. But I think also, as I said earlier, we have to find a solution for coal, and that's going down both having a timetable but going down a CCS road. So you're not going to Indiana and saying there's no coal. That's a killer. You're not going to get anywhere. You have to say, we're going to have to invest in this kind of technology by a certain date, which is exactly what we did under the Clean Air Act amendments for SOx and NOx. And, it happened, you probably know the story, much more quickly, much cheaper than any of the estimates. And, we actually believe, this is where, do you believe in the market? I don't know. Does anybody believe in the market right now? But, we do believe that if you actually got the policies in place, things would get going at a much faster rate, and then they would build on themselves. And, people would, the thing about a cap on carbon is, I was talking to a guy about this last week. He said, this is really interesting because it's a tax that you don't have to pay if you become more efficient. If you become more efficient, if you figure out a new technology, unlike every other tax that you have to pay, you actually don't have to pay it if you don't emit the carbon. So there's a real incentive, that's the whole point, not to emit the carbon and to try to figure out what your other alternatives are. Indiana is probably, there are a bunch of states which are just almost impossible to get get that kind of support. It's going to be very, very difficult. But there are others where you can. You go to North Dakota. North Dakota is a state, it has lignite coal. The coal policy is very important to Conrad, and but it also has unbelievable wind potential. Huge, vast wind resources. So we want to balance that out. We want to be sure that the wind voices are there, as powerfully as the lignite voices are. And even in Illinois, and it was interesting when Obama was a candidate, he originally, early on, had some coal policies that we weren't that thrilled with. coal, was a big political issue in Illinois, but very limited number of jobs, 3,000 jobs. At one point, it had been 30,000 jobs. Now it's 3,000 jobs. They've already lost, a huge proportion of the jobs. So, actually having a real, very substantiated case on the job side is the most important thing. I think. I think that's. And then the other thing is, if there's an auction of the carbon allowances, that creates a huge revenue source that can be used both to invest in new technologies and also can go back to the consumer to defray the additional costs of electricity, which is very, very important. And everybody's concerned about a bump in price, but there are very few areas where revenues are available right now. And for the last few months, I've thought, well, the thing that's really going to move this is this revenue stream out there when the country really is looking for money. And the important thing, if that holds, is that the revenue is actually directed to benefit the issue at hand. That it doesn't go into the general treasury or something. That actually a portion of it goes to invest in clean energy technologies, and then the balance is used to reduce the impact to the consumer. Because in a state like Illinois or Pennsylvania or North Carolina, where coal is the dominant source of electricity, the rates are going to go way up. But the thing about it is, I live in New York City. Our rates are 14 cents per kilowatt hour or something like that. In these other states, they're very low. They're like 8 cents, 7 cents. So, why? There's already a big differential, and how you kind of. That's why the early investment in weatherization and long-term investments to actually reduce energy costs are so critical. So you just don't, it's not just business as usual and we're paying more, but actually that you've made the investment so that you're paying less because homes are, much more energy efficient than they've been in the past. And there's an opportunity to make buildings, 30 to 50% more energy efficient than they are now. With investments that actually put people to work. It's sort of a win-win. And making that win-win real and then being able to document it, I think is just a very crucial part of the equation. And that's what we really have to do right now. We're sort of past the issue on the science side, although there are those, for example, the House Science Committee who will still argue that. We really shifted from that to what are the solutions? Do they really work? How do you put them in place? And then how do you substantiate that they actually are working? Because I actually think that's where the shift is right now, even though we don't have the political support that's really necessary to move this forward yet. Yep, back.
Could you speak a little bit about the role of the Council on Environmental Quality in regulating carbon, specifically the National Environmental Policy Act? There's been some discussion about how to try to incorporate, regulating carbon under NEPA.
Yeah, Nancy Sutley is the new head of the Council on Environmental Quality. She's from Los Angeles. We work with her a lot out there. One of the things actually in this transition to green is, and we had an early conversation with her, basically every agency has to take climate into account. And she's going to be reviewing the regs for NEPA to really try to figure out how to do that, because we think very strongly that and then the question is, can she do it from a regulatory standpoint, or would it actually need some kind of a legislative change? We think she could do it from a regulatory standpoint. And one of the things that's interesting is that this sort of issue of green in the administration permeates across all agencies. It doesn't just reside in EPA or in the Interior Department or DOE. The new Housing Secretary, Sean Donovan, who is from New York, is all over this. The whole issue of weatherization and low-income housing to reduce the cost of energy is huge. And the Department of Transportation, making sure that the new Transportation Act, which is going to be reauthorized in this Congress, actually is a climate-friendly transportation act. So in every agency, there are actions that they'll be doing. In NOAA, where Jane Lubchenco is, working on ocean acidification, and some of the scientists say that this is the scariest part of the entire science equation, absolutely changing the chemistry of the oceans fundamentally. So she's actively looking at that, and I think that'll emerge, not imminently, but over time. It's definitely on the agenda because it does permeate everywhere. And so sort of what the climate impact is a key part of it. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. Looking at the Waxman Marquee bill that was just released
Right.
as a basis or a stepping stone for an international agreement,
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could comment on a couple parts of it. One being the inclusion of international forests in it.
Yeah.
The second being having technology transferred to the developing world being conditional on them ratifying an international treaty.
Yeah. Well, I think that post Bali a year ago, too many people traveled around the world to go to Bali and discuss, how can you bring the developing countries into this debate, into this discussion. And tech transfer and forests were the two key issues. So I think Waxman's done a good job sort of putting those out there. And forests haven't been part of the discussion too much. I mean, they've been part of the discussion to bring the developing world in, but they haven't been too much of the discussion in Washington. They cause 20% of the emissions, so avoided deforestation is very, very important. The way it's being looked at is to provide offsets as a way of containing costs in the bill, and that those would be shared between domestic and foreign. And I think that it's one of the toughest issues in Congress is going to be how you deal on the international side. There's a lot of members who are saying we're not going to do anything if China and India are not part of an international agreement. I mentioned we met with the climate negotiator for China. They are not going to join a one-size-fits-all agreement, and neither is the rest of the developing world. So to bring the developing world in, there has to be sweeteners for them, and it's going to require the developed world to put some kind of resources on the table. And, I think what Henry's done is he's sort of put out there a few ideas to begin the discussion, which I think will be very favorably received, probably more favorably received in the developing world than they will be received in Congress. But, it's the beginning. Yep.
I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the tech transfer side of that, and I've been trying to research it for one of the classes I'm taking, and what I found is that tech transfer seems to be this kind of really ill-defined and ambiguous term that can mean anything from actual, transfer of cutting-edge technology to just investing in development projects for,
I don't think anybody knows yet what tech transfer is. Tech transfer is money going from here to there that's significant enough to make those countries want to play. That's what it is, and what it's. We don't want to. We're at the end of the pipe. You're creating this. We're experiencing the impacts. You have to help us through this. So it can be money for adaptation. It can be new energy technology. I mean, one interesting thing is, China's investing much more in CCS technology than we are. And if we don't get going, they're the ones who are going to be selling that technology to the rest of the world, not us. But still, to get them in, you've got to have some kind of tech transfer, which Minister Xia was, careful to say international intellectual property rights would be protected. Yeah, that's a huge issue. People don't really believe that. So nobody knows what it would look like, but it involves enough to develop an agreement that the developing world feel that they got some benefit to participate in an international regime for a problem that they didn't create, and that's the bottom line. So there's lots of different suggestions that are being put on the table for how you do that through forest policy and technology policy and other things, but exactly how that would be structured. They're thinking of creating a fund in the Treasury Department. But just taking forests for an example, there's a very big push to put a lot of money on the table to protect the lungs of the world in Congo, Indonesia, and Brazil. There are 70 countries now that allow illegal logging. I mean, how do you substantiate that those forests are actually protected, that they're additional, that they're verifiable, that these things actually work? And nobody really knows. I mean, those are the mechanisms that people are trying to design right now. But you're designing for places that don't have systems that are working now, and you're putting a whole new layer of system on it, and that's that makes it very, very complicated.
I mean, I guess the thing I wonder is if using even the term tech transfer is kind of counterproductive, because it lends this idea that if only we would transfer this existing technology, as Michael Oppenheimer says, send a boat of widgets over to China, that they'd instantly be adopted and that our problem would be solved. Whereas, really what you're talking about is both the technological diffusion of new technologies and these massive development projects that really just involve money.
Money is a big part of it. I mean, this is really, I mean, and the whole first part was getting the developed world to act, and a lot of the developed world started doing something, and we didn't. So now, what we do matters more than anything. I mean, that is just the beginning of, without the United States actually taking very strong steps before December, the whole thing could just fall like a house of cards. But there has to be some kind of transfer. The problem is, and it's a very, the economic reality of the world is so different than it was when this whole issue first was put on the table in Bali, 15 months ago. That now, I mean, I know there was a meeting in Great Britain a couple of weeks ago where, the British negotiator basically said, we've got to put money on the table. And they said, there is no money. So I actually don't know how that is going to be resolved in this economic climate. It's got to be in the out years. It's not going to be something that's going to happen right away. I think you could put in a framework, but actually a transfer of funds until the recession sort of come out of it, it's going to be very, very hard to do. And I think that's one of the most complicated things right now, that what looked like something that could be designed coming out of Bali is just orders of magnitude more complicated right now. And I don't know how that's going to be resolved.
It seems like there's so many different groups working on the Asian climate right now. Many of them from sort of different perspectives, whether the big environmental organizations or more grassroots campaigns like One Sky,
yeah.
Coalition. How do you feel like that dynamic works out? Is there enough cohesion and coordination?
First of all, I think it's great. The more, the better. I think it's absolutely critical that there's a range of perspectives. They all have the same goal, and they serve different functions. Coordination is very, very important. We actually have a climate and energy committee of the Green Group that actually incorporates a lot of these other groups like the Alliance for Climate Protection and One Sky and US CAN, and the Power Shift groups that had the event in Washington last month. So there's a tremendous effort on coordination. To me, we have to do that. That's absolutely a bottom line. But we also have to get out and do. So, we may not all agree on and US CAP's a great example. We were part of US CAP. We thought there was real value in it because we really felt and feel strongly that you're not going to get climate legislation if you don't have a business voice. A lot of the groups don't like US CAP, didn't go far enough. They have a huge important role to play. Go out there and ask for as much as you can possibly get. And, we'll work with the groups that we're kind of allied with to move them forward. But right now, as I say, this is the end game. We're in it. And we need all of the above and more. And the biggest thing that we can do is to work in a coordinated fashion if we have disagreements to address them privately, not publicly. Yep.
I want to get your opinion on something. A friend of mine in Colorado who, about a year or so ago, sold a solar company, and he's been working on his concept of what he's calling U.S. energy bonds, and it's sort of modeled after the war bonds, where these would be bonds that could be sold to the American public to create ownership in,
Yeah.
a new energy policy and a new energy economy. And there would be an ROI, and it would be, I guess, you could, I think it was, I don't know all the details in my head, and been updating it, but, it would be like a 5-year investment. You would start to get a return. You could sell those investments off early, but it's sort of based mostly on the whole, war bonds concept. So I wanted to ask you about that, and then I came in a few minutes late, so I don't know if you addressed at all nuclear power or mountaintop coal mining.
No, but I will. So bonds. I mean, I think that there are a lot of innovative ideas on how to unleash a clean energy economy, and I think the more the better. A group will emerge as successful. I don't know whether that would, but if he has a good business design and people are willing to invest in it, great. There are so many. I mean, one of the things I think is just incredibly exciting are it might work legally, but actually, if it gets investments, is the question. But there are so many people who see this as a huge opportunity for them. And the greatest aspect of it is the amount of innovative thinking that's going on, and really making that real. I mean, I speak to a lot of people. A lot of people come through, and for years we talked about the problem of climate change, but people just had a very hard time trying to figure out what the solutions were. Now there's just a tremendous amount of innovation. Everybody has their way of designing the solution. A number of those will work, and the more people thinking about it, the better. Mountaintop removal, that's a really interesting issue. Coal is a problem from the beginning to the end of the pipeline, from mining all the way through the burning. And the Bush administration, particularly on the regulatory side with EPA, really allowed policies under Clean Air, Clean Water for mountaintop removal. It was very, very weakly regulated. Lisa Jackson has already taken on a number of reviews of those existing regulations to tighten up. And the ash spill in Tennessee, I think, was a great reminder and revealer to the American public about what the consequences of coal mining and coal burning are. And I think one of the things that's really been amazing over the last year is there's a very active campaign across the country to prevent the permitting of new coal plants. And a year or so ago, there was 150 new coal plants on the drawing boards across the country. And one of the things was the utilities were trying to get in under the regulatory wire of climate legislation. And so the environmental community kind of joined together and has gone after a lot of those plants. And over 80 plants have been they've basically been stopped in the permitting process, and they can't get the financing. So, I mean, I've really been quite astonished at how successful this campaign has been. And I think, the coal industry, I mean, they're not on the run, but they're certainly under the gun as far as, having a lot of focus on what the implications are to people's health, to asthma, to communities that are adjacent to where the mines are taking place, to what the climate consequences are. I mean, the whole range of impacts are now much better understood and much more under the microscope. And, there's much more of a focus on actually how do we shift away from that over the long term. But as I say, I think, in the short term, coal's with us. We have to regulate it as carefully as possible so the environmental impacts are minimized. But there's still huge consequences. And then,
I was just going to, there was what I understood just before Bush left office, there was a regulation, I forget the name of it, that didn't pass, that was relaxed just before he left office, that allowed the coal industry, particularly in
West Virginia,
the Southeast, relax their standards.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting in the last days of the Bush administration. They were working hard to get those midnight rules out right before the end. In the last days of the Clinton administration, they were working very hard to get the midnight rules out. We applauded those all. I mean, that's and then as soon as Andy Card came in as the chief of staff, he issued an executive order stopping all those changes, which is exactly what Obama did. Rahm Emanuel did as soon as 5 minutes after the swearing in. So that's just politics. That's the way they operate. On nuclear power, 20% of our electricity comes from nuclear plants. There are 104 nuclear plants in the country. There are about a dozen nuclear plants on the drawing board. There hasn't been a new nuclear plant in the last 30 years. The issue for us on nuclear, first of all, there are issues with nuclear power, which are safety, proliferation, and waste issues, which have always been a problem. They haven't been solved. They still need to be addressed. Economics has always been the key issue. Does nuclear power compete with other sources of energy? It's very expensive. The nuclear industry always has their hands out for enormous subsidies. They got considerable subsidies in 2005 and the 2007 energy bill. We actually worked very hard on the economic stimulus package to make sure there weren't more nuclear subsidies in it, and there weren't. But the nuclear, and our view is it's a mature industry. It's not an innovative new industry that needs government help. They should, if they could stand on their own and compete in the private sector with other sources of energy, let them. But that is not the game that they play, or that they've ever played, or that they intend to play. So, there'll be a lively debate about nuclear energy. I think there will be more nuclear plants. Will nuclear replace coal? No. I mean, it's just too expensive. There's no way, I think, in the United States, in the system that we have of generating electricity and how we pay for it, to assume that 50% of our power will ever be produced by nuclear.
Where does the Obama administration stand on it? Because I know that he had nuclear backers.
Yeah, it hasn't been that revealed. I mean, he's said in a couple of statements, clean energy incorporates nuclear. The question is, does that mean subsidies? Which is not clear. And, I think the other issues of concern, the proliferation, security, and waste issues, are going to be on the agenda of his agencies. They're going to have to try to figure out how to deal with them. But I don't think, he's not a non-nuclear guy. And he's not a non-coal guy either. And actually, coming from Illinois, those are both two significant sources of power in Illinois. Exelon's the biggest, I think, nuclear utility in the country. And, they have coal in Illinois. So I think, that's sort of where he comes from. The question about nuclear is really how you do it. What's the role of government? Do they subsidize it? Do they manage it? Do they address the issues that are of concern to people? I think there will be new nuclear plants. They'll mostly, I think, be in the southeast and Texas, because I don't think other parts of the country are going to allow them. The siting would be just very, very challenging. That's my sense of it. Any other questions? Last question? Well, how long are we going for?
How about the last question?
Last question. Okay.
I answered one, and they build off sort of questions that people had asked earlier. First, going back to the question that was just asked about how everyone is working together on the ground in different organizations, if you could comment on sort of the environmental justice community in California and sort of their response to California's
very good question.
And sort of, is there a fear now that a bill has been put on the table and that the environmental justice is going to go against sort of allowance trading and things like that, and sort of.
Well, the environmental justice community is opposed to trading, and they were opposed to trading in California. They had a bad experience with trading in Los Angeles, and they translated that they're very worried about hot spots being created from not so much from carbon, but from trading of keeping kind of dirty old plants going. They have an important voice. They need to take it to Congress. We've been in discussions with them about it. They're first of all, as I said, Lisa Jackson is deeply committed to environmental justice concerns, and her door is wide open for them to go and talk to her about those concerns. And I think, Henry Waxman's is too. I think that the issue is, we're in discussions with them. We don't see it the same way, but, it's a dialogue going on. But they need to go and work in the legislative process, and we're happy to do that with them. and get the issues on the table. But I think, the conversation that's going on is a cap and trade program. That's what's happening. And there's no indication it's going to be anything else. Most people who propose taxes are people who actually don't want legislation passed. Because no politician will put their head up on a tax, and none has. Except, as I say, some people do it because they could say, well, I'm for controlling carbon, just put on a tax. That's what the economists say. But that's not what the politicians say. So, if the EJ community thinks that tax is the right way to go, I just don't think we're there. If Obama starts going down the tax road, we'll go with him, but I just don't think that's going to happen. So I think the other thing is, how do you construct a regulatory environment so you don't get these hotspots? So that the issue that they're concerned about is not so much the trading, but the consequence, that you don't have those consequences. And that's a design issue. And what's the other question?
I guess my other question was going back to what Maura asked earlier about the politics around how to get the Midwest on board.
Maybe you guys can help.
Maybe. I guess I was thinking more in terms
I
of
keep telling her to move to the Midwest with me. She's from California. She doesn't want to come. I've been telling her for months we need to go to the Midwest together to solve this problem.
We need people on the ground in the Midwest, from the Midwest, telling them they need to do it.
She looks like she's from the Midwest.
My question has to do with sort of how do other items on Obama's agenda interplay with pushing forward climate change legislation?
No, that's a good question. I said sort of facetiously, we were so lucky that Tom Daschle didn't become the head of HHS, because if he did, health would have been the first thing on the agenda. But because of his problem, and they didn't have a head, and I don't even think that Sebelius has been confirmed yet, climate and energy was first. So that gave us some momentum to get going. And because there's a real jobs part of it, and we can actually tell that story and prove it, this is about how you get people to work. And the more we tell that story, I think the more forceful it's going to be. But I do think, we'll be, the healthcare and the energy issue will be entwined up against each other. Different people are going to have different things. Like Max Baucus, he's very committed to the healthcare issue, but if there's a revenue part of the climate legislation, he's going to be in charge of it. Is he going to pay attention to it? Who knows? So, as I say, I think we got an early advantage because of the Daschle mess, which allowed this issue to get on the table and get going and get some momentum. But I think it'll be caught up. And I also think Copenhagen's a very serious deadline. The Obama administration, now he's in London. And, the international community is expecting the United States and Obama to come with something on the table. That's a big motivator. And, the healthcare issue doesn't have that deadline out there, and neither does the education issue. So, we have to keep the momentum up.
And that's a great way to end. Thank you very much.
And you have to keep the momentum up.